All right, let's get started. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kevin Schell, and I am the Speakers Director of the William F. Buckley Jr. program at Yale. Also online is our Membership Director, Rosie Braceras, who will be co-moderating this event alongside me. I'm excited to welcome you all to our discussion on modern-day book burning, the new digital censorship. As Amazon increases its share of both the physical and ebook markets, the threat of censorship via book banning has become realer than ever. Amidst pressure from political activists, corporations have found themselves forced to choose conformity, often at great cost to the intellectual diversity of our politics. As a result, we are glad to have two authors who are personally very well versed in this debate. Now, before I introduce our guests for this afternoon, I'd like to say a few words about the Buckley program. The William F. Buckley Jr. program is an organization dedicated to promoting intellectual diversity and open political discussion at Yale. We host lectures, dinner seminars, firing line debates, and an annual conference every year since 2010. Our over 350 Buckley Fellows have a wide range of political beliefs, but they all stand united against the formation of a liberal-only echo chamber on campus. By providing Yale students with a forum to engage meaningfully with serious conservative thought, the Buckley program has become an institution on Yale's campus and a symbol for a more open and more representative political atmosphere. Especially at a university where the cultivation and creation of new knowledge is key, Buckley Fellows believe that all perspectives must be heard and examined in good faith. You can learn more about the program and how to become a fellow on our website, buckleyprogram.com. Now I'll let Rosie introduce our guests. Rosie, I believe you're on mute.
My apologies. Abigail Shrier is a freelance journalist and author of Irreversible Damage, the transgender craze seducing our daughters. Her articles can be found in a variety of publications, including the Wall Street Journal, National Review, New York Post, Newsweek, and others. Ms. Shrier is a graduate of Columbia College and Yale Law School and serves on the board of advisors for the Foundation Against Intolerance and Racism. Ryan Anderson is the president of the Ethics and Public Policy Center and the founding editor of Public Discourse, the online journal of the Witherspoon Institute at Princeton. He is the author of several books, including When Harry Became Sally, Responding to the Transgender Moment. Mr. Anderson received his Bachelor of Arts degree from Princeton and his doctoral degree in political philosophy from the University of Notre Dame. We'll have each of our guests deliver brief opening remarks on modern-day book burning and censorship during the digital age. Kevin and I will ask a few questions, and finally, we'll have questions from our audience, which you can submit through the event using the Q&A feature on the lower panel on the Zoom video window. Please join me in welcoming Abigail Shrier and Ryan Anderson virtually to Yale and to the Buckley program.
Ms. Shrier, you may begin.
I begin. Okay. Thank you so much for having me, first of all. So, there's been a lot of discussion around, how to regulate these market dominant tech firms. The classic comparison that's always made is whenever you suggest that these companies ought to be broken up, or they ought to be regulated, or they ought to be, or their Section 230 exemption should be stripped. The comparison that's often made is to something like the Colorado Bake Shop. The idea that, well, isn't this just the free speech of Amazon? Isn't this their right? Isn't this Target's right? Target was the company that pulled my book. Isn't it Target's right to decide what it should carry? And the difference between those things, and I think this is an important thing to keep in mind, however we ultimately decide to handle this controversy, is that there's an important difference here in scale. Scale matters, right? Scale is the difference between homicide and genocide. It's a big difference when it's Target or Amazon removing a book because one person on social media complained and your local bookshop, okay? And there are a few reasons it's very different. First of all, if you have a bookshop like Marxist Books, and Marxist Books only wants to carry very far left-wing books, that's its right, and we all recognize that. That's also its free speech, okay? We wouldn't want to impute to the owner of Marxist Books, you know, the views of a book that it doesn't support and is that undermines the message of its bookshop. And we all can recognize why in America you don't want to force the owner of Marxist Books to carry, say, a right-wing book or a book that the owner doesn't agree with. But things are very different when you're talking about a company like Amazon, which controls over 80% of digital books, the marketplace for over 80%. What that means when you're talking about a pipeline to 80% of the books, you're talking about a company that is so powerful that literally books will not get written because you can't get an agent to represent you and you can't get a publisher to buy your book if Amazon will turn off its pipeline for you. It's a massive difference. Nobody believes that if Marxist Books were to refuse one individual conservative writer's books, that it would have that kind of effect on the marketplace. But Amazon absolutely does. And the idea that you can just sort of create your own Amazon is, of course, farcical, right? It's not that it's completely impossible, but it's almost impossible. You're talking about, you know, warehouses that each cost hundreds of millions of dollars that are automated to guarantee next day delivery. This is a massive, massive, you know, operation. And so, you know, replicating it is quite difficult. The problem, of course, is that our antitrust laws aren't exactly, you know, didn't envision Amazon, right? They look for things like collusion among, you know, monopolistic companies. And of course, Amazon, and that's very outdated requirement. There's no a need for Amazon ever to coordinate with Google. They can do it automatically, right? They monitor each other all the time. So I think, you know, I'm sure you're going to get to this in your questions, but I think, you know, obviously Justice Thomas laid out very interesting, you know, options for how to handle this. But the problem is real because the books that Amazon will not carry will not get written. They will not get bought. They will not get sold. So you're talking about a shrinking in the variety of speech that I don't think we've ever seen before in America.
Dr. Anderson, the floor is all yours.
Great, thank you. And thank you. Everything Abigail just said, you know, unless I wasn't listening closely enough, I think I agree with 100% of what she just said. I think that was entirely accurate. And it's a pleasure to be back virtually at Yale. I was at a Buckley conference. Oh, geez, it would have been 6 or 7, maybe even 8 years ago now. It was before the Obergefell decision, because I was on a panel with my publisher, Roger Kimball, who I believe is a Yale alum, and then Brett Stevens, who I think also might be a Yale alum. So I was the, you know, the Princetonian on the panel. And we were talking then about some of the gay marriage questions and, you know, future of the GOP. And that just like that memory of the last time I was at Yale for the Buckley program shows just how quickly some of these things have changed in the US context. I want to come at this question a little bit differently just initially and to say, what are we afraid of that we're banning books to begin with, right? So before we even get to some of the legal questions, you know, how do we think about the market dominance that Amazon and some of these other big tech companies have? You know, how do we think about the limits to our liberties, right? All of our liberties have limits. Before we get to some of the legal political philosophy questions, I just want to step back and ask, like, what is so dangerous about Abigail Shrier's book, Irreversible Damage? What is so dangerous about my book, When Harry Became Sally, that you see both Amazon in my case and Target in her case saying they refuse to sell the book, right? What are they afraid of when it comes to the exchange of ideas, the exchange of arguments, the exchange of evidence? You know, Abigail interviewed hundreds of people for her book. It's, you know, a journalist looking into the phenomenon of the recent rise of, you know, transgender identity and non-binary identities, particularly with girls. why would a big tech company want to shut down one side of that debate, right? And I actually think it's a sign of insecurity, right? I mean, the reason that you want to no longer sell a book like that is you think it's actually persuading people. It's changing minds. It's educating people, right? The fear of a book like Abigail's, if it had no impact, then they would list it, they would sell it, no one would care. It's precisely that a book like hers is being read and it's being influential that they're afraid of it, right? So I think the first thing to say about the modern day book burning is that it's actually a sign of weakness. And on that theme, I'll just add, like, as I've been reading some of the recent op-eds published in the Washington Post and the New York Times on some of these transgender questions, it just strikes me that there is a lack of intellectual rigor when it comes to some of this. When all of a sudden Andrew Sullivan is considered no longer, fully LGBT friendly, it suggests that something important is going on in our culture, that the ideology is getting so far ahead of itself that they have to prop it up with force, right? So that's the first thing to say about, modern day book burning. It's not a sign of intellectual strength. I think it's a sign of intellectual weakness. But the second thing to say is it is a sign of economic strength. It's a sign right now of economic and political strength. The timing of this, particularly more so in my case, because Abigail's book was removed from Target back when Trump was still president and Attorney General Barr was still running the Department of Justice. In my case, it was as soon as the administrations had switched and right when Congress was about to debate the Equality Act. Why did Amazon sell the book for 3 years? I mean, my book's 3 years old, because I think they were afraid of what someone like President Trump, someone like Attorney General Bill Barr, someone like Senator Josh Hawley back when he was in the majority party, right? I mean, I actually think that there was a sign there of political fear, but now the stars were aligned so that economic strength and political strength went together. And they're flexing their muscles, right? And so, I mean, this is plutocracy, right? Where you have, the powerful political forces and the powerful economic forces combining. And so to my mind, it's entirely appropriate for conservatives to be concerned about this. This isn't, economic liberty rightly understood, right? Everything Abigail said about, if the mom and pop bookstore down the street that has a particular identity and a particular worldview, right? So it's both the scale and I think it's the identity. If you're the Marxist bookstore, you shouldn't have to carry, free market books, right? If you're the Christian bookstore, you shouldn't have to carry atheist books, right? And if you're the Protestant bookstore, you shouldn't have to carry Catholic books. And if you're the Catholic, we can see that. But if you claim to be the everything store and you put the vast majority of those stores out of business, throughout a decade-long process of saying, we're going to sell everything. And then you get, an 80% market share on that business model. And then once you have that economic power, you kind of, turn on the heel and you now say, oh, we're going to be excluding all of the books that we disagree with. Or maybe not all of the ones that we disagree with, because I imagine they disagree with Hitler's Mein Kampf, but all of the ones that we disagree with that also might pose a threat because they might be influential, right? It's not just that they disagree with it, but it's that they think it might persuade people on an issue that matters, right? That's, I think, what the real situation is here, right? It's a sign of intellectual, not strength, but weakness, but a sign of economic and currently political strength, which I think means that, how this is going to be settled is going to be through the political process, right? I think Justice Thomas gave some I'm not a lawyer, so I won't speak directly to some of the legal merits of a suit along those lines, but I am a philosopher, and I think he is accurately describing the common law and the natural law tradition's way of thinking about property rights and the limits to property rights. They're not unlimited. They're both justified and then limited by how they impact justice, how they impact the common good, how they impact human flourishing. And so you can abuse your market power. And there are all sorts of examples throughout American history of big businesses that abused their market power, and then the state in various ways regulated them. That's not a strange phenomenon, right? And you can just go through American history and look at various ways in which the state had to kind of articulate what the limits of property rights are. All right, so with that, I will stop and turn it back over to our moderators.
Yes, thank you so much for that. So I know Ms. Shrier and Dr. Anderson both mentioned Justice Thomas's opinion, so I feel like it would be best to provide some context for that. But last week, Justice Thomas noted an opinion that Amazon controls 42% of the book market and physical book market and 89% of the ebook market. And he wrote, quote, "We will soon have no choice but to address how our legal doctrines apply to the highly concentrated, privately owned information infrastructure, such as digital platforms." Now, Dr. Anderson, I know that you mentioned that you were not a lawyer, but if a case involving Amazon's control of the book market reaches the Supreme Court, how do you think the justices should rule? And Ms. Shrier afterwards.
Well, I mean, so a lot will depend on what the legal theory is, right? I mean, so it's it's hard to say how the justices should rule without knowing kind of like what the fact pattern is and what the legal argument, because what I've mentioned the day that I found out about this decision about Amazon in my case, I wrote something for First Things, went up on their website. And to a certain extent, I see big tech as kind of, it's at the intersection of, antitrust law and monopoly law, common carrier and public utility law, anti-discrimination and public accommodation law, and then what in a government context would be considered like a limited public forum, but here it might even be applied to like a company town. And Justice Thomas made reference, if I believe correctly, it's the Marsh case, and Abigail, correct me if I'm wrong, because you're an actual lawyer. It strikes me that big tech is kind of at that intersection, that crossroads of those four historic buckets of how the law has thought about various limits on government power, right? There's an antitrust monopoly, there's a public accommodation and anti-discrimination part, there's a common carrier public utility part, and then there's like a limited public forum and whether or not certain private businesses actually become like limited public forums. So anyway, all of which is to say is I don't know how the court would rule or should rule on any given case until we actually see the fact pattern, the legal theory, and then, the briefing for it. I will say that in the Amazon context, Seattle, as part of its anti-discrimination public accommodation law, includes religious ideology, or sorry, not religious, political ideology as a protected class. And so if Amazon is only censoring conservative books by conservative authors, they may be running afoul of the very law that they supported when applied to Jack Phillips, the baker. Amazon signed on to an amicus brief saying that Jack Phillips should be forced to bake the cake and that he did not have a First Amendment protection against that law. Right? They were arguing that his very act of creating a cake that was meant to convey a message was neither speech nor religion. And so he did not have a First Amendment claim against the anti-discrimination law. And so now when you put those things together, the scale of Amazon compared to Masterpiece Cake Shop, and then the fact that, putting a book in an envelope and then sticking it in the mail isn't artistic creation, nor is it speech. It strikes me that what's good for the goose is also good for the gander. And so Amazon may be running afoul of an anti-discrimination law. But again, like this is going to be something for lawyers to really dig through.
Yeah. So, I think the common carrier claim is stronger than the antitrust claim for bringing against a company like Amazon, because first of all, the way our antitrust law has worked is to prohibit monopolization that would hurt the consumer. And right now, consumers are not being hurt by Amazon; they're getting lower prices. So that's one problem. But another problem is that in order a prohibitively market dominant company it has to be so dominant, and I'm not sure we're seeing that level even with Amazon. But I I think it's very hard under the antitrust laws to break up Amazon. It doesn't mean it couldn't be done, but I do think it's harder argument. I think the common carrier argument is stronger. The extent to which we're all completely reliant on various internet sites for everything in our lives. I mean, certainly literal and virtual travel. To have this conversation. What it means, it's a lot like having your phone company shut off your telephone line, to have your Zoom connections shut down and whatnot. And the idea that those companies that are so dominant can then choose which of you it likes. I mean, we're going to see so many conversations distorted. And one of the things I just want to mention is, my book, for all the hysteria around it, is a very simple, ordinary book in a lot of ways. It just makes the argument that a lot of these medical treatments that young people are getting are not being overseen by doctors, because the way the standard for giving out hormones is now affirmative care. So there's not much medical oversight, and a lot of these treatments have very dangerous medical side effects. Now, that's a very, very standard sort of claim. It's the kind of claim that attends every single medication that's advertised on television, right? We warn you that the following side effects may occur. And that, in effect, is what my book says. There are a lot of side effects. There are a lot of things to worry about here. I never am in favor of banning anything, but it to that extent, it's a very vanilla argument. And the thing to understand is how illiberal and how unreasonable the cries for censorship are. They have become so extreme, and they are absolutely not in the interest of anyone who thinks that, gosh, we really should examine our medical protocols with every medication to make sure that they're safe, right? It depends. All the things that we, put in our bodies are going to depend on a lot of questioning by people like journalists and others who examine and write about them and whatnot and interview experts. And the idea that those should be banned as hate, it just shows you sort of how extreme we are today, how extreme how incredibly sensitive the trigger for these companies' censorship, is. It's such a light touch that's required in order to trip them. In the case of my book, in Target.com, we had one Twitter user, I think, complained, and that was it. And this is just not sustainable in a society that wants to, that needs to explore what's going on and why, and is it safe?
Could I add one thing to what Abigail just said? Was so good that it reminded me of like another reason that you want to read books is not just because you already agree with them, right? I mean, so like when she was saying, this censorship is illiberal, that prompted to my mind, like the whole point of a liberal education, was to liberate you from just preconceived opinion and from, kind of like just what you already happen to believe. It was actually like, it would be liberating this form of education because you would hear lots of different viewpoints, right? I love reading books that I don't agree with because they challenge my thinking, right? That's what's good about being educated. And so like, there's also something about the approach to modern day book burning in which it seems like, well, why would anyone want to buy this book except for people who agree with it? Right? I mean, so there's a vision of what books are all about and what reading is about and what education is about that looks much more to me like indoctrination, right? And I think that's a huge part of the current cultural moment that we're in.
That's exactly right. I mean, the point of all of this is to get at the truth, right? To help us get closer to the truth on any issue or any predicament we're in. And, that's what the scientific method takes for granted, that we're all out here with various hypotheses, testing them. And the problem with the moment we're in is they are not allowed to be tested. I have no problem if anyone were to point out an error in my book. No one has, by the way. No one has. But if anyone were to point out an error in the science it's based on, that would be good in my view, because it's important to make sure that any medication anyone is taking is safe and appropriate. and has medical oversight. The problem is we can't have this conversation. And that's really a dangerous place to be in, where you can't search for truth because you're never allowed access to any other side.
Yeah.
It used to be that liberals stood up against book burning and censorship of ideas. Now it's the other way around. Why do you think the left has abandoned its defense of free expression? Abigail, you can go first.
Okay.
No, I think what Ryan said was excellent on this, that, it shows real weakness. They're absolutely terrified. And this is the left. Look, the number of people, my book has, I have a lot of liberal support for my book. A lot of liberals I interviewed for the book. Most of the researchers were actually politically liberal, but they often describe themselves as politically homeless now. And the reason is because the hard left is so intolerant of any discussion. And for the reason Ryan said, I think that was really important, that you have this incredible intellectual shallowness, which they act as if they're going to absolutely collapse if they're met with something they don't disagree with. And I do think it shows a real fear. And I think it also shows that they know something very bad is going on. When I hear from medical students, from professors, from researchers who've been run out of their jobs, I mean, these are top people who have said they will go to medical conferences now that are so politicized that if someone dares challenge a hormonal drug or the research it's based on, that they will be shouted down because it's a fans only zone. That is not where we want our medicine to be. And of course, we all suffer, liberals and conservatives alike, when we, are forced to swallow this hard left extremism, which is so intolerant.
Yeah, I agree with that entirely.
Thank you so much for that. I know that much of our conversation has revolved around the search for truth and the need for competing viewpoints for us to arrive at that truth. But do you think that Amazon really cares about the truth? It seems to me that Amazon has a profit incentive to ban certain books that are unpopular with its audience. And given these incentives, if you had the audience, what argument would you make to Jeff Bezos or his successor that they shouldn't ban books like yours?
I mean, one starting point there is that show me the evidence that this is actually a good market-based decision for the bottom line. I don't think any of these, whenever you see the corporate boycotts, they're boycotting Georgia this month, they're going to boycott another state next month. These aren't being driven by, our customer base is demanding this, right? If Amazon would have kept my book up on their website, they were going to lose business. More people were going to shop at Barnes and Noble. I mean, I just don't even see either the logic or the empirical evidence that that's what's going on. I think something else is happening here, and it's a form of woke capitalism, right? Where you're not making economic decisions about how you run your business to maximize shareholder value or something like that, something Milton Friedman would want you to do. And what you're doing instead is saying, in addition to whatever our kind of business purpose is, selling widgets or whatever, we're also going to now have a social justice component. And we're going to engage in the political process, not the historic way of, donating to candidates, making arguments, but economic boycotts, right? We're going to make it so economic costly for the governor of Indiana to sign a religious freedom bill, or the governor of Arkansas to sign a sports bill, or South Dakota, right? Whatever the state is, or Georgia, a voting bill. We're going to use our economic power for a political objective that, roughly speaking, half the country disagrees with us on, right? If you look at many of these issues, these are 50-50, maybe 45-55 issues politically. And so it's hard to believe that, someone like Amazon, all of its customers line up on a certain side of these issues. Or, I think it was the NCAA or one of the sports team leagues just announced that they were boycotting one of the states. It's hard to believe that, all of the baseball fans, in the instance of the All-Star game, are against that Georgia law, right? And so I don't think this is being done for economic reasons. I think this is largely being done for cultural reasons, kind of woke capitalism, social justice. And then what I would say to the people, you said if I was in the room with the decision makers, I would say, this will be terrible, not only for your business, but for our country. If you care about like some modicum of civic unity, while we disagree about politics, we can't politicize everything, right? So like baseball, the American pastime, was a way in which I don't care who you vote for, I don't care which church you attend, we're all Yankee fan or we're all Red Sox fans. And the more and more those institutions, these things that were commonalities where, regardless of our particular identities, whether it was partisan identities or religious identities, when we no longer have those common spaces, I think it's really, really bad for civic unity, because we need to be able to live together even as we disagree about these things. So my pitch to the big CEOs would be, you're either going to further divide us, or you're going to be one of those commonalities where we can come together. And it's not going in a good direction right now.
I totally agree with everything Ryan said. And I would just add that, number one, it's not responding to market forces, which is what's so disturbing about this trend. It's Islamist in its absolute extremism of, my way or the highway type view of the hard left. But something else too, we're not as divided as we think. And the reason I know we're not as divided as we think is because I get the emails. I get emails of people from across the political spectrum. I just got an email recently from a top advisor to one of the top Democratic candidates for president, okay, who said, I can't say this publicly, but I agree with you, blah, blah, blah. I get this all the time. So I can tell you, the idea that we're actually deeply divided on some of these issues is simply not true. The problem is a tiny, tiny minority of extreme far left activists are able to use social media to shame and badger, major companies. And I think we need to let go of some of the fear of losing our halo, because it's a nonsense halo. Okay, you're not virtuous because you banned a book. Okay, that's an incredibly intolerant thing to do. Somehow Amazon has it wrong. The idea that, if I got rid of that book, then the young people will like me. Well, the people leading this movement represent a tiny, tiny group, but they are very, good at manipulating social media. And they're, unfortunately able to, leverage a tiny, tiny numbers to have an outsized power. And they're completely warping our discussion. And unfortunately, we need to get back to a place. If you're Amazon, if you're the bookstore for everybody, then be America's bookstore. Okay. If you're Google, then be America's encyclopedia or, messaging service. You have to exist, for America. And right now, America is nowhere near as radicalized as this tiny group that seems to be pushing everyone around.
Thank you for that. In the past, Amazon has banned books espousing conspiracy theories, such as denying the Holocaust. Do you think that Amazon should ban these books? And if so, where do you draw the line at what is acceptable to ban and what is not? Yeah.
I mean, I would tell you just personally, for a bookstore like Amazon that is of the scale that it has, I would just make life easy for myself as the CEO or as the content moderator and say, we're going to follow First Amendment standards, right? So if it's legal and, people are interested in buying it, you don't have to list everything at Amazon, right? If no one's interested in, don't waste the time creating the page. But what that would mean is, no incitement to violence, no fighting words, no kind of, handbooks on how to do things that are illegal. There's certain limits on what you can publish under the First Amendment. And that would be my standard. And I think if more social media companies adopted that standard, right? So, on Twitter or Facebook, right, you don't want to have incitement to violence. You don't want to have, those but don't say, well, we think this is fake news or we think this is misinformation, because then you yourself as the moderator are going to get caught in endless kind of like unsettlable disputes over what is fake news and what's not, right? And you probably aren't equipped as that content moderator to answer that, but your platform probably could, right? Have the free exchange of ideas. And, if someone posts something on Twitter that's wrong, chances are someone else is going to call them out on it. And then you're going to have the discussion there. Allow these platforms to host the discussion rather than thinking that some moderator somewhere can put the thumb on the scale and always get it right.
That's right. You have to allow hate speech because our First Amendment does. I mean, we allow hate speech in America. We don't allow, here's how to blow up a building, anything that would incite violence, or here's where an abortion doctor lives, because that's very dangerous. That's not speech. What that is a target, making someone a target for a violent act, which is very different. But absolutely, you have to allow all kinds of speech and allow people. Look, people are adults, and the idea that we stopped, letting people read and examine things for themselves is a very huge loss and a very sad thing. I mean, it's a little crazy. We instead police fact checking, as Ryan said, and this fact checking is completely asinine. It's a completely fraudulent enterprise. I know I've been fact checked myself. I've been fact checked in my opinions that even proved correct. If they criticize the administration, the current administration, I mean, this is bizarre stuff that you don't see, certainly I don't remember ever seeing in America. It certainly didn't typify America until recently. So, you don't police other people's, opinions for facts because, of course, new evidence. First of all, new evidence always comes to light, and second of all, they're very dishonest about these so-called facts they're evaluating. But we should have open discussions on everything: the safety of vaccines, the safety of medications, the safety of our immigration policies. I mean, all these things you don't fact check them. You allow people to have an open discussion and bring new evidence to light, because we must be unified at least in our hope to eventually, get to truth and get to real evidence. And that will only happen in an open discussion.
Dr. Anderson, you mentioned First Amendment standards for Amazon, and I know Ms. Shrier has also talked about the common carrier model. But I was curious, and this brings us right into an audience question. Is the problem you're referring to more of a monopoly problem than a free speech problem? Dr. Anderson, if you'd like to start.
Sure. On the part of something like Amazon, I think that gets to Abigail's point about scale. If Amazon was, the local bookstore down the street here, and they didn't want to sell my book, that would be fine, right? Because the local bookstore down the street here is one of and let's say this was 2 decades ago, it would have been one of several hundred bookstores in DC. Today, the local bookstore, it's not right down the street, it's blocks away because Amazon has put many of the local bookstores out of business. Amazon now has, 80 some percent of the ebook market and whatever the percent is of physical books. And that's the scale difference, right? And so when a company like that refuses to sell the book, what does that do for the entire market of books, right? Who's the next author that's going to write a book that might run afoul of the Amazon censors? Because if you lose access to 80% of the market, why are you writing that book to begin with? Who's the publisher that's going to publish a book that might run afoul of the Amazon censors? And now if you're the author and the publisher, and you're like, whoa, but look, when it happened to Ryan and Abigail, they went on TV, they had op-eds written, their sales maybe in the short term, it's that's not repeatable, right? Think about all of the authors that we've never heard of who are getting their books delisted. Think about all of the books that are being dislisted that we don't even know about because they've been delisted and they weren't high profile enough. Think about all the books that won't be written to begin with out of fear of being delisted. The local bookstore down the street 20 years ago didn't have that power. The local bookstore down the street today doesn't have that power. Amazon does, right? And so whether it classifies as a legal monopoly or not, that's something that the antitrust lawyers would have to look into. as a cultural economic force, though, precisely because of the scale thing, right? Abigail's first comment on today's Zoom, like that's to my mind the concern, and how it impacts the market in books, which therefore impacts a culture of the exchange of ideas, right? Because the books are one vehicle for the exchange of ideas, and that's what we're getting at in the pursuit of truth.
One thing, and this isn't, I don't know if I'm supposed to directly answer that question or talk, if I can talk about something else, but just to, one thing that occurred to me when Ryan was speaking is I keep coming back to in my mind what he said about, the fear at the heart of all this censorship. And I think that's absolutely right. And when they poll young people, so-called Gen Z, those born 1995 and after, their view, and they are behind to a large extent. They are pushing a lot of the censorship. The rates of delisting, deplatforming speakers are highest with this generation of speakers on campus. The rates of, complaining to administrators that so and such professor be fired. This is really new. And I think it goes along with, they also poll at very, very, or survey at very, very high levels of pessimism, not only about the world around them, but about their own efficacy to affect change. They're very doubtful that they can make a difference in the world. I have a lot of thoughts on why that might be, but one thing I would say is this generation really needs an injection of optimism, okay? Because they're actually able to influence a great deal. You're seeing the civilization being brought to its knees largely because of this generation, or at least, partially because of its influence. So it's a powerful generation, but they need to, they really do need a dose of optimism that not only can they have a huge impact, but they can handle it. Whatever the it is, life, hardship. They just lived through a year of pandemic where they had to sit at home with their parents or, and talk to friends only on Zoom. I mean, they can get through things. They've proven that. And I think they need to know, and maybe they need to be a little more exposed, but they need to know that they can confront ideas they disagree with too. They'll be okay, get their evidence together, make their arguments. They can win. They can show the other side was wrong. But this whole cowering and sending off emails, please cancel this speaker, is really quite pathetic. And it's not American. And it doesn't bode well if we don't turn this around.
Another audience question states that asks whether you think that censorship is corporate America's version of cancel culture, and why is it only in one direction? That is, everything to the right of extreme left views are getting canceled. And what are the implications of this for future discourse and the quest for truth, and what can be done to sort of correct it?
A lot there. A couple of thoughts. I mean, I think why is it only happening to views that are to the right of extreme left views? I think partly those are the people who are in power right now. That the ideological capture of various businesses, and in particular when it comes to kind of Silicon Valley business, the people who created these businesses, the people who run these businesses, have a very unique set of political and cultural values that might not be in keeping with average Americans. I think Abigail is exactly right that when we talk about the polarization of the country, it's at the elite level and particularly at the political elite, but ordinary people are not nearly as polarized on these questions, right? And when I was still at the Heritage Foundation, I was having people who disagreed with me on a lot of other issues, willing to work together and to speak at Heritage on, the gender identity question, precisely because they thought that their political elites didn't represent them. So I think part of it's a power thing, who's in power, and that's in combination intellectual. It's a sign of weakness, but economic and political power. And when you put those things together, I think it's a particularly bad combination, because when you know your ideas aren't as strong as you wish, how do you prop them up artificially? And it's through economic and political power. So I think that's, why are we seeing it now? Why are we seeing it on these issues? Why are we seeing it only go in one direction? That would be my initial stab at the question.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, the alt-right is a real thing. It has a very nefarious influence. It's a real thing. It exists. And where it's not working is Google. It's not working at Google. Okay, it doesn't have almost any cultural influence, and it's not working for Amazon, and it's not on Twitter. Now that's not entirely true. Obviously, I'm exaggerating, but it is. This does sort of track with class to some extent and education, and of course generation. You're seeing this far left group, of young people really pushing a lot of the censorship. And I said before, we know this. I'm not just making this claim. We know this because deplatforming on college campuses, of conservative speakers has shot up in this generation. And I would just say, it's really important. I think it does only go in one direction, and it's really, really important that we turn this around. Now, I have to acknowledge my own bias in this, and that is that I'm a Gen Xer and born in 1978. And one of the things that apparently characterizes, I just interviewed someone about this, but an expert on this. But anyway, one of the things that apparently characterizes Gen Xers is that we sort of pride ourselves on being sort of thick-skinned, able to talk to anybody. But I can tell you from many, many Gen Xers that I talk to, that it's true that we do pride ourselves in it, that we did have friends across the aisle. And when I hear from college campuses, I hear about self-segregation and stigmatizing anybody who's friends with someone they don't agree with. And it's just, they need to take, really, the young people today need to take that back. They need to take back the ability to explore ideas and have friendship and conversation, even with people they share nothing in common with. It's so important because it makes you better. It helps you argue better. It helps you realize what you know and what you believe. And it's such a profound loss that those friendships and that exposure is really being limited and narrowed. So I guess my hope is that somebody out there will be inspired to sort of take that back.
Thank you for that. Now this question is for Dr. Anderson specifically. An audience member asks, you've written about how it is not sufficient for conservatives to only make religious liberty arguments, but should also make positive substantive arguments for their ideas as well. Does this apply with regards to the sort of censorship that we've been talking about today, or are the market arguments most important in these debates?
Great question. And that's an interesting analogy between, doing the procedural religious liberty thing versus the substantive thing. And then, how does it map onto this? And I think the answer is you need both, right? So there's going to be a procedural, legal argument about monopoly power or common carrier or, something like that, right? And so we're going to have to think about, some of the, what's the right legal framework for thinking about regulations here. But there also needs to be a substantive argument about why we don't want this sort of big tech censorship to begin with, right? Why is it unhealthy for a culture not to have a robust exchange of ideas, arguments, and evidence if it wants to arrive at truth? And then I think all of that's at the service, though, of the substantive arguments that matter most, which are the types of arguments that, I make in my book, that Abigail makes in her book. Maybe we're right, maybe we're wrong. The only way you're going to show us that we're wrong, though, is by actually engaging the substance of the book, right? Not delisting us. That doesn't persuade either of us. If you delist our books, you haven't persuaded us that we're wrong. You haven't persuaded our readers that we're wrong, right? If you're going to persuade people that we're wrong, you actually have to make a substantive argument on the merits, citing evidence, facts, reasons. That's the currency of intellectual discourse, right? So anyway, that's just a long way of saying I think it needs to be both, right? We have to think about what the right legal framework is, but we also have to make an argument for why we care about a culture that respects the exchange of ideas. And then we have to utilize that culture to actually exchange ideas, right? Serious meaty substance.
Are you waiting for me to respond, or is that whichever? I can.
I believe Rosie has a question for you.
Yes,
Okay,
sorry about that.
No problem.
So sorry, hold on. Having technical difficulties. My Wi-Fi cut out. Okay. So Lisa Littman, Michael Berry, and even Ken Zucker have all been viciously attacked and ruined. How do we combat the culture of fear around telling the truth about controversial issues? And how would you give advice to your own kids on speaking out on controversial issues?
Okay, great question. Okay, a few things. First of all, it's important to know that these, it looks like, Ken Zucker, as you mentioned, was fired. Lisa Littman, her paper was criticized and originally taken off the Brown website. But it's important for you to know that these people are thriving. Okay, they are widely respected worldwide. And the reason they are is because they have something called integrity. Now, integrity doesn't it's a vanishing asset, let's say. But it is real. And those who have it, it's an amazing thing because it's actually more prized than ever. It's so rare. Okay, but it's really important. See, here's the funny thing about the truth. You don't have to propagandize all the time. You don't have to go around knocking on thousands of doors when you've actually hit on the truth. You just need to say it once, put it out in a publication, write something. That's it. And it takes on a life of its own. Why? Because it's true. Because other people come to realize you're right. It's a big deal. It's so much more powerful than spreading some of this mindless propaganda. And I would just say that if you want to live a life of meaning, a life where you're proud of what you're doing, where you can be proud of, to your children that you have made some worthy contribution at all in your brief time on this earth, then you really ought to be oriented towards truth. And if you go around parroting these lies, I can't help but think at the end of the day, you'll look back on a life that was awfully shallow and really didn't provide sort of the things you were hoping to get out of it.
I think we have time for one or two more last audience questions. And one audience member, shifting towards the present, asks about the recent attempts by the right to boycott Coca-Cola, Delta, and MLB for the stance they took on the Georgia voting laws. And I was wondering if you had a reaction to that or the boycotts themselves of Coca-Cola, Delta, and the MLB. Dr. Anderson, you may start.
On the boycotts themselves by the companies, I think they're misguided. I think that they're divisive. They're alienating half of their customer base. They're further dividing the country. Like they should be in the business of selling Coke, flying airplanes, playing baseball, not then using their economic power to try to put their thumbs on the scales of a political debate, right? That's not the way that we engage in the political process. So I think they're misguided in doing it. I think it's going to have bad consequences for their businesses, right? Because I think more and more fans are going to be tuning out Major League Baseball as a consequence of this. So there are going to be bad economic consequences. I also think there are going to be bad cultural consequences because like baseball was one of those pastimes that you could, talk around the water cooler with people who you might not agree with and you find a commonality and, all the things Abigail was just talking about, why it's important to be friends with people who aren't like you. Baseball provided a venue for that, right? So I think it's bad. In terms of then the customers boycotting, I'm of two minds. On the one hand, I don't want to politicize every one of my economic decisions, right? I don't want to have to, I'm flying tomorrow at an airport and say, wait a minute, right? When I'm getting coffee, is this one of the coffee shops that's boycotting a state? Should I, go to a different terminal? I don't want to have to politicize my life in that way in response. But on the other hand, what else is going to stop these companies from doing this unless they pay a price, right? And the price is either going to come from politics and law, or it's going to come at the pocketbook. And right now, conservatives don't have much political power, given that they don't occupy the White House and they don't control Congress. So it seems like the market is where they can push back on these corporations. And so that part of me says entirely appropriate. If Major League Baseball is going to boycott Georgia, entirely appropriate for fans to say, then we're boycotting Major League Baseball, with the end goal, something of a detente, right? Something of, if we know that this is going to be mutually assured destruction, if we both keep boycotting, eventually we just stop engaging in this to begin with, right? That would be the desired outcome. We'll see if it happens.
Yeah, I think I have two concerns on the hyper politicization of everything. So there's the macro. This is completely exhausting Americans. We are so exhausted by everyone's sensitivities about this and that, and what Trader Joe's brands are acceptable and which are not. We are getting so exhausted. And the problem with that is there are real threats. White supremacy does exist. There is hatred. There is racism that we have to confront. And if we are so exhausted by nonsense, we won't have the heart to confront it. We won't have the heart to defend an America that where we're so force-fed so many lies, and we won't have the heart to care about each other. So you can't constantly bludgeon us with this is the brand we're all boycotting today. It's completely exhausting and it's demoralizing. There's something else too that's happening that I think is happening to conservatives specifically. I know we talk about, okay, their books, their ideas might get shut down, or their accounts will be shut off, or and by conservatives I actually just mean anybody who's not under the left's halo, because I've seen this happen to liberals as well. But I'll tell you something very bad is going on, and what's very bad is, and the very bad thing is that you see a shallowness even from young conservatives. Now, I hate to say that, but it's true, and here's why. Because they're forced to join a team right away. Okay, they know that's how they're going to get their protection, so they immediately sign on to a team. So when I'm interviewed by young people, very often they'll say to me, whether they've read my book or not, "Don't worry, I'm on your side." And I find that very troubling, because it goes along with, well, how do you know? And how do I don't trust you to represent any of my ideas fairly, because you already are on my side, whether you know what I had to say or not. That's not a good move. But I think that young people are being forced into this because they know they're going to need protection. And so I would just say this is doing damage to everybody, this constant, tribalism. And it really is, it's something that it's up to your generation absolutely to push back on.
Thank you. I think this might be our last question, but both of your books are critiques of modern gender ideology. And I was wondering why this issue of modern gender ideology is so difficult to discuss, and if there are other issues out there where dissent is as taboo as this one, and why is this issue the hot topic?
So I don't know who should speak, but I have some thoughts on this. I'll just say, I'm sure Ryan does as well. I don't know who's supposed to speak next.
Go first.
Okay,
yeah.
So I'll just say, look, I know a lot of transgender people. I'm transgender adults. I've interviewed a great many for my book, and I can tell you honestly, and I mean this, really from the bottom of my heart, that the hard left, group that claims to speak for them does not represent the majority of those I have spoken to. Okay, which means these are very nice people that you can talk to, that are, would absolutely want as your friends and neighbors in every way. Okay, so the ideology being pushed is not even necessarily being pushed by transgender people. It's being pushed by far left activists. And so the way to understand them is that they're like every other extremely intolerant, far left activists. They are very similar to what you see from Black Lives Matter and other far left groups. And it's all about shutting people who they decide are privileged up. In the case of gender ideology, very often it's about shutting up women. I'm sorry you're uncomfortable. I'm going to march into your prison or whatever your protective space is. I don't care, and you're not allowed to say anything. It's a highly intolerant movement. And the reason that this particular ideology has sort of taken off, I think, is because if they can get you to lie completely, if they can turn the world upside down, if they can make you say that a biological man really truly is a woman, then they have total control over you. And I do believe at its heart that this is a movement about control. It's not about, promoting, the rights of transgender people, which is something we would all want. And should all want. It's not about giving them, protecting their job rights and housing rights. It's about controlling other people and making them say things they don't believe.
That was great. I don't even know. Maybe I have two comments to build on that, but I agree with everything Abigail just said. First thought is that I think it's difficult to have this conversation because of social media. Have it in person. It's actually not that hard, as Abigail just said, to have this conversation in person with ordinary people, including ordinary people who identify as transgender, right? Where the activists are and where the professional kind of political class is different from 90% of the rest of America. And so that would be one thought. And then two is that, look, the reason it's difficult, this conversation to have, is that one side of the debate has intentionally used a technique of saying that people who disagree with us aren't just wrong, but they're evil. They're bad people. They're bigots. They suffer from transphobia. They hate trans people, right? This was intentional, right? There are activists on the left who use those sorts of techniques to delegitimize any disagreement, to shut down any discussion, and to make the cost of sticking your head up so costly that fewer people are willing to do it, right? And so the technique can work, but only if you allow it to work, right? I mean, there's a reason why they deployed this technique, because it gets results. And so, the piece of advice I would leave you is don't allow anyone to intimidate you into silence. Also, don't allow anyone to radicalize you into a bomb thrower, right? Don't become the type of person who gets on Twitter and just starts, mouthing the most extremist rhetoric because you're like, well, if they're going to attack me anyway, I might as well give them, red meat. Like, control your own speech, be your own person, and don't let people who are trying to box you in either way, either by making you an extremist yourself or by silencing you. Because my fear is that the Amazon thing, it silences the vast middle of America that can have a grown-up conversation on this, and then it just leaves the two extremes in a shouting match, and that's a terrible place to end up.
I think that's some great advice. And with that, we'll probably wrap this event up. Thank you so much to both of our guests for taking the time to speak to the Buckley program. And thank you to our audience members for their questions. Have a good evening, everyone.